God bless you. God bless you is a funny thing to say in this day and age, but I mean it from my heart, even though my heart is not pure. What keeps us away from religious faith nowadays is that we have awakened to our own corruptibility so deeply that we're ashamed of it and we don't want to face God. So we go round the world alone. We go round the world alienated, as if we were being hunted by our deepest self. And our deepest self is inside. If you have the courage to go inside, into the room in your own heart, you find that there's somebody else there. You find that there's a kind of presence that enfolds you, that feels like it's coming from beyond the boundaries of yourself. It's penetrating you like a kind of magnetic field or like rays of the sun. It's a presence that emanates from other humans and other animals, and it resonates from the lake and the sky and the sea and the mountain and from the ocean. It's a real presence. There's no doubt about that. And when you go to the room in your own heart, that's the presence you experience. But as I say, we're so aware of our own corruption that we run away from it and we create this surface self, this sense of identity which is material. And at the heart of it we put an empty hole, just a vacuum. Where the presence used to be, we just create a sort of absence, a nothingness. So we're always uneasy, we're always anxious, and we move around the world, running and running and running from one thing to another away from ourselves. And even if we find psychotherapy that helps us deal with that emptiness, cope with that emptiness, understand that emptiness, give a language to that emptiness, it's still an emptiness. It's still just an empty hole at the middle because there is no meaning in life. Therefore, how can I have meaning as a spine in my life or in my story if there is no meaning? And each day we awaken like robots to that emptiness inside. So I'm not embarrassed to say God bless you. I'm not embarrassed to spend my life trying to find in the room of the heart that there is another presence. A presence, as I said, that penetrates the boundary of one's own self, and which we experience as emanating from all the other matter and materiality in the universe, from all other human beings and animals, and the light of the sun and the darkness of winter. Everywhere there is this exquisite, beautiful presence with us. Emmanuel. Think of the Christian story as just a metaphor for a moment, because it's much more than that, but it is a metaphor as well. Just think about it as the metaphor for all the light in the universe, in the cosmos, all that is reaching out to us with a sense of relationship, a sense of wanting us to belong in that light, wanting wanting us to return to that light and think about all that finally from the transcendent depth of being, further than the furthest end of the universe. And it reaches us, it finally reaches within human history in the person of Jesus. And so the hagiography or the gospel or the history or whatever it was begins to create a memory. Born in a stable, a parent homeless, a fragile, delicate infant. Not even a bed, not even a cot, not even a room at the inn, but just in an old stable, a human being. Imagine that as the metaphor for all that light, for all that experience of joy and peace that you feel in your heart when you go into the room of your heart, when you experience the sense of transcendence reaching you, the sense of love and relationship there is on a great mountain or at the ocean, or sitting with your loved ones, or sitting alone and looking out at the birds feeding on a feeder. In any situation that you're still blessed enough to be alive, still able to experience other human beings around you, other living beings around you, other plants around you, when you're still able to experience space and time and materiality. Think about how blessed it is to feel the presence of another who penetrates yourself like waves, like magnetic fields, like the heat of the sun just going through your bones, making your soul one with the soul of the cosmos. Think about that, and think about it like this is the God coming to the surface. This is all the light in the universe, which even in physical terms never shows itself until it reaches something. You know, light going through the darkness can't be seen. It's when it hits something, it's when it bounces off some materiality that you see it. Think of all the light in the cosmos surfacing in the moment of Christmas. Think of Christmas not historically, but in your heart now. The fire is on, the snow outside, the warm, cozy evening, cinnamon in your hot whiskey. Alone or with friends, with family, or just thinking about those that you loved who have gone into eternity, who have passed away and left you in grief. Think about everything penetrated by the ultimate light of the universe's ground. And that is Christmas. Happy Christmas, and God bless you. And thank you for being here too, because I want to share a couple of stories, favourites from a few different times in the past 10 or 15 years. And I'll start with one which is about the loneliness of Christmas. I wrote it in 2012. The house has been emptied in readiness for decorations and Christmas lights. I stuffed a bin so full of rubbish that I could barely wheel it down the hill to the crossroads, where a white horse shivered and stared at me from a field. He came to the ditch, to the barbed wire fence. He wanted a hug, I suppose, and he was dripping wet and had no shelter from the wind, so I stopped and rubbed his nose and talked to him for a few minutes. I asked him what he thought Christmas would be like without a stable for shelter, or without God for comfort, now that we've both been forced to accept the barren indifference of the universe. The horse looked me in the eye and said, "The universe is not indifferent." Then a magpie landed on the horse's back, and a white minibus passed en route to Carrigan-Shannon, with old mountain folk like James, a bachelor who owns the horse but doesn't realize that horses can get very lonely if they don't have company. James is never lonely, though he washes his dishes alone and makes tea with well water and sips it all night, with nobody but ghosts in the other chairs. Sometimes I see him beyond the wipers on winter evenings in storms of sleet, his tea-cosy hat cocked to one side as he wheels a barrow of hay to where the white horse stands. And as long as James breathes, the white horse knows that the universe is not indifferent. The temperature went below 0 last week, and the mice arrived. I found one in the hot press, and I was reading in bed one night when I felt something move under the pillow. His tail was sticking out as I tried to hide, so I grabbed him and flung him out the window. I suppose all animals want to gather around a warm hearth, though the flying mouse probably took a dim view of the universe. Last Friday, I was Skyping a friend in London who teaches in a school where they call her Mrs. Brown because of her Irish accent. She was chopping a cabbage and I noticed a mouse on the shelf behind her, a London mouse, though he looked no different than ones in Leitrim. I was glued to the screen as his little snout dipped into the sugar bowl. "Mrs. Brown," I declared, "we need to talk about mice." "Ah, yes," she said haughtily, "you probably get a lot of them over there." I said, "I'm looking at a mouse right now." "Poor you," she said. "I don't mean here," I said. "I mean there. On the screen I can see a mouse behind you on the shelf." She froze. "Where is he?" she whispered, as if the mouse could understand English. "In the sugar bowl," I said. She turned and saw the sugar bowl. The mouse saw her. Then she screamed and I heard something clatter on the floor and the screen went blank. Later she tweeted to say her iPad was intact and she was listening to BBC News. And then another tweet. "What does Morsi think he's up to?" Tweets are invariably about big issues. Twitterland is a place where people can be shallow at a global level. "I'm gone off Bama," somebody tweets, after Israel bombarded Gaza. As if Obama was an adolescent upstairs and she was listening to a squeaking bed. When her iPad was back in action, she Skyped again while she was dressing a roast for the oven and microwaving a mince pie. I said, "That's dangerous," but she didn't heed me. She bit into the pie, its innards now as hot as the melting core of a nuclear reactor, and she screamed as her tongue sizzled. And again the screen went blank. I waited for her to call back. I'm always waiting for one thing or another. In fact, during December, I do little else but wait for the darkening climax of the solstice and the light of Christmas. And as I waited, I tweeted again. 3 tweets, like doodles scattered into cyberspace. Horse, mouse, moon, a child born or not born. That's how I tweet. Just small things or single words, like bread on the deep water. I cast them out for fun or in quiet hopefulness. I float them on the waves to see what will return, because the horse convinced me that the universe is not indifferent. You know, that one, that story, that memory is 10 years ago, 2012, and I was still in a way caught in indifference myself. You know, I was still caught with this sense of almost not giving myself permission to have faith. I think that's a really common experience for people in the world we live in the West, where because the tide of kind of collective conscious attitudes about who we are is so secular and so materialistic that it seems an anachronism to talk about faith. And because some of the institutions seem to be discredited because of, let's say, scandals in Western culture, in Christianity, or the misogyny of various other religious institutions in other countries in Asia and the Middle East. Because of all those problems, it seems very, very difficult to affirm a sense of faith, or even to know what faith is really. And that's where I was in 2012. What I didn't know was, I had just come out of an operation at that time, but I didn't know that I was also going into an intense depression, and that the depression, looking back on it, was very much to do with indifference. It was a kind of despondency. And despondency is a kind of it's a place which is very, very dark. And so it's very hard to have faith in those moments. And I think that's where I was when I was holding on to the relationship with the horse, the white horse, as some sort of symbol. It was like the only possible way there was a presence in the world was this image of a ghostly horse, himself lonely, looking across the ditch at me. And I'd love to read you another one from that time, which is on the same kind of subject, even though it's not around Christmas, but let me share it with you. As I said, it's from about, April of 2012. I was in the ballroom of romance last week, where the toilets haven't changed much in 30 years. So I combed my hair in the tiny mirror before stepping out onto the best dance floor in Ireland, sprung from beneath by tractor tires, and where years ago I often jived with the Tommy Andy girls, one of whom always carried a knitting needle to curb the enthusiasm of frisky young farmers. Last week, the same old floor vibrated with jazz dancers commemorating Jimmy Croston, a Leitrim man who was deported from Ireland in 1933 as an alien for his communist politics and his attempts to propagate socialism and dancing in Leitrim by means of a small corrugated hall in Effrina, which he ran and which was once riddled with bullets and finally burned to the ground one Christmas Eve, an act of God that must have greatly pleased the parish priest. The quick step and jive were all the rage when I first arrived at the Ballroom of Romance around 1974. Frisky boys would sometimes arrive on their tractors, on warm summer nights, fresh from mowing fields close by, their wheels leaving a trail of grass on the dry roads. One boy would drive while two others clung on, in standing positions on the rear box, and the threesome often smoked in this tableau, and looked as magnificent as something from a Wagner opera as they arrived in the car park. Not that the clergy disapproved of smoking. The priests smoked pipes, and old men smoked non-tipped cigarettes, and everyone else smoked Albany. Even children smoked. I have a friend who remembers a neighbour woman entertaining 9-year-old boys with glasses of orange and single woodbines, allowing the little creatures to puff away at her back door like real men. No wonder the clergy took a dim view of human nature. If the species was left to its own devices, it would probably self-destruct, and so the need for God, or at least a parish priest with a sharp tongue, was essential. To contemplate the universe without an overlord was an appalling vista that may have kept the parish priests of Leitrim awake at night for decades, bitterly regretting their own wasted youth in the constrained psychological cages of Catholic seminaries. The universe without an overlord is a subtle theme in Werner Herzog's movies, but he seems quite calm about it all. I saw his latest work, Into the Abyss, in the IFI last week, the Irish Film Institute, and afterwards, on a link from London, he appeared live for a question and answer session. No, he doesn't believe in the universe, or that it is reaching consciousness through our eyes, or that the cosmos cares much about us. I believe the human species may die out eventually, he said, and if that happened soon, I would not be concerned. Well, of course he's right, but it's not a subject much discussed in Leitrim. Auschwitz and its philosophical implications don't bother old men who live lonely lives up the hills and who long for the lorries that fracking might have brought to brighten up their untarred lanes, and who lean on the counter in the post office each week as they wait for the clerk to dole out their little pensions. "How's your mother?" I heard one old man ask the clerk last week, probably because he danced with her long ago. 20 minutes later, I saw him in the supermarket, leaning against the meat counter for support, his face as white as marble and short of breath, and fingering a 10-euro note as if measuring up what he could afford. I suppose old men can survive on small portions. Even the famous flute player, Peter Horan, who was as thin as a rake, survived on little more than bread and tea for years. And it's hard to imagine old males actually cooking anything in those galvanized roofed cottages where it's always dark and there's still fly paper hanging from the brown tongue-and-groove ceilings. But they do eat, and then wither eventually on pillows like inmates of a death camp. And old priests die, and filmmakers die, and I suppose the abyss that opens before us on the pillow is what makes us cling to the idea of an afterlife and eternities of conscious bliss. Meanwhile, all that jazz endures, though the dancers have moved to more sophisticated venues with names like Club Kiss, where young people shake it like randy monkeys, believing they are special and that despite the odds, they will live forever. I was struggling for hope, I was struggling, and yet I was trying to be honest and truthful. And maybe that's the real pathway to faith. That you experience yourself sometimes in a desert, or you experience yourself sometimes in depression. And you have two choices. One is to try and get out of it, to construct a false narrative of hope. That there is some sort of alternative, that there is some sort of way out. That there's some sort of change in you that could happen that would make everything different. And in that situation, you reach for somebody who will give you a new narrative. In my experience, and when I read Christian texts of mystics or hermits, people afflicted with despondency, it seems to me that in that desert, in the terrible sort of darkness and bleakness of loneliness or aloneness, the first great wisdom is to name it just as it is. It's why I love the work of Samuel Beckett. There's nothing can be said about Beckett to say how beautiful his work is, because it embodies despondency, yet it doesn't vanquish hope. It bears witness to despondency as in itself being the realm, the remedy. It's not like saying, okay, not feeling good here, let's go look at it in a different way, and then I'll feel better because I'm different. It's like saying, this actually is who I am. These shadows around me are the reality. They're as natural to me as my fingernails. And then there's a phrase comes to me which I have had as a motto all my life, and that is per tenebras ad lucem. Through the darkness, through the shadows comes the light. Through the shadows. It's not that the darkness is some kind of way station and then you get to the light somewhere else. It's that actually in that darkness is the light. I think that's, for me, that is the message of Calvary, Golgotha. The death of Jesus is in the death, is the resurrection. In St. John's Gospel, it talks about Jesus being lifted up on the cross. When Jesus was lifted up on the cross, and the word lifted up that's used is the word that would also be used conventionally for, like an ascension or for being raised up in glory. When he is lifted up on the cross. It's not different from the cross. Liturgically, we make a distinction, and in the narrative and the hagiography, we make a distinction between the moment of death for Jesus and the risen Christ on Sunday morning, 3 days later, after the Sabbath. But in John's Gospel, it's much more fused into that one real moment. And I got a lot out of John of the Cross, and I did a podcast on John of the Cross, 1 or 2 podcasts about him, if you go back and look for them. But in John of the Cross too, there was this powerful sense that the darkness itself was where the light is. That the troubles in life weren't actually stepping stones to something pleasant and new and fresh, but they were in themselves the place that you can find light. So also then mortality becomes something that you can focus on and find the light within it. Not a sentimental idea that, in a sense, you go through this thing called death, and then at the other end of it, at the other end of the tunnel, there's somewhere nice you'll turn up. No, but that in death itself, there is a powerful sense of light. There's a wonderful fella I'm reading at the moment, and to be honest, I can't remember his name because I'm just going to mention him, and I hadn't planned to talk about him, but he's an amazing theologian. He talks about the fact that death in itself is nothing. There isn't a kind of a stage called death. There isn't a place called death. It's just from the point of living and living and living and living, and then there's no threshold. It's just there's not life anymore. And in that moment, this particular theologian I'm talking about suggests therein is the complete and deep encounter with God. At that moment, it's like encountering your own complete self and discovering that your own complete self is the ground of all being, that it is God, has been with you all the time. All the time. And that sense of Jesus on the cross, or somebody, any human being who is close to death, is finding a great embrace within their own self of God's presence. And that's why I think that, I think, is like the darkness that we feel in despondency is not necessarily a place to be afraid of, because it's somewhere within that darkness that is the light. I find it strange and beautiful as well how in icons, when they paint the light, for example, if you see Jesus Christ in the resurrection icon or in the transfiguration icon, he's always surrounded by a kind of a enamel-shaped glow of black or purple. Now, normally you would see, a saint surrounded by a kind of a halo or a great kind of orb of golden light. And the icon painter or writer would use gold leaf and lavishly to create that beautiful, powerful sense of gold, which reflected light so well in candlelit cathedrals and churches and monasteries. When you go into a monastery where there are a lot of icons, the power of gold and the way it flickers in the light. Or sometimes in an evening, when an evening sun is coming in through a window and it hits an icon, and you could barely see much on the altar, and you can see the icon because the gold is reflected by the sunlight, the setting sun. So the gold is used all the time to depict this sense of the light of heaven. And yet when you get to Christ in the transfiguration, Christ in the resurrection, he's surrounded by a kind of purple or black orb. The reason being that this is the Word of God. This is as close to the ultimate ground of being as will be possible in the surface of all cosmic history. And God dwells in unapproachable light, as the Eucharistic prayer says. Unapproachable light. Light so dense that you don't see it. It's dark. And so sometimes the darkest thing that you experience in despondency, when your heart is heavy, is in itself the breath of God. That's a really, really tricky one to talk about. And I find it tricky to talk about. I've been through 10 years of this journey with various problems of ill health, and when I look back on things I wrote, like that last story about the ballroom of romance, and I see myself, if you like, wavering between faith and non-faith, wavering between, a sense of despondency, a sense of the black empty hole within one, the existential meaninglessness of life, and at the same time the wish to have faith, the wish to recover my own faith in the poetic beauty of the Jesus story, and at the same time then an unease to do it because I felt like, it's not very popular in the days that we live in. And we all want to go with the fashion. I mean, it's how we survive as human beings and as a species. We belong to each other, so we go along with each other, and most of the time it's really right and good to go along with people and to forsake your own strong view and say, well, I feel this, but everybody else is going this way, and I belong to them, and I must go with them. There was a great example of that in the liberation theology days. They used to use the word compañeros, compañeros, Spanish word like company, but it meant compañeros, it means the breaking of bread. So it's a word that's kind of very essential to the idea of Eucharist, of breaking the bread, sharing the cup of wine. They're your sisters and brothers. And so they would say that we must accompany people in their struggle. It was like saying, we are not Marxist or liberationists, we are the church, but it's the church's obligation to accompany people, to be with them in their struggle, in their journey. And I went through 3 or 4 years where a therapist was helping me to make sense of the pain I was feeling psychologically around 2012, 2013. And it was really, really difficult to make sense of that despondency or loneliness. The stuff that you find in Beckett, the stuff that you find in your own heart. And sometimes the stuff that you find at this time of year. Like there's nowhere worse than Christmas Eve for things like loneliness and stress and anxiety to surface. For troubles in marriages. For fractures between families. For misunderstandings between parents and children. There's nowhere it'll come up better than Christmas Eve. And I talk in the beginning of this about the fire lit and the snow outside because it's a Dickensian image of security and beauty and loveliness, and we use those images to kind of comfort ourselves or protect ourselves against sometimes the abyss of family dysfunction, family disorder, and violence, and rage, and anger, and drunkenness, and all the mess that can happen. We try and shelter in these images like Dickensian notions that there is some kind of Christmas that is like that. And it really never works out like that because there is no Christmas like that. The best you'll get from that is you'll end up, looking at a nice movie or something. But what I'm saying to you is there is a Christmas. There is an amazing, joyful moment that says, Emmanuel, God is with us. But here's the real crucial thing that I'm trying to share with you on this Christmas Eve. It's found within the darkness. It's found within the loneliness. It's found within the despondency. Whatever the fracture is, sometimes it can be family dysfunction, it can be substance abuse, it can be all sorts of things that bring unhappiness to your door, or it can sometimes be something within that creates a weight in your heart. Whatever it is that makes you kind of go away from your inner self, go away from the room in your heart and try and walk the roads at a level of materialism and just feel, well, there's an emptiness inside and that's life, and you become ironic about Christmas. What I'm saying, I suppose, is that even in those moments, go inside into the room of your own heart where you don't want to go now. You don't want to go. Loneliness is when you don't want to go inside to your own heart. Loneliness is when you don't want to face what's inside in your own heart because you think it's going to be something uneasy and heavy and disturbing and full of grief or full of anger or full of just unpleasantness. But go in there. Go into that space. Feel it as a darkness. And stay with it. And when you stay with it, you will hear the angels singing. Emmanuel, God is with us. God is with each one of us. In that silence, in that solitude, in that loneliness. The cross is not an ordeal to be endured so that you get this payoff on Easter morning. The cross is the moment of complete surrender to what you think is death, but in fact is the full embrace of God. the complete darkness that you feel in your loneliness, if you stay with it, you will hear the angels leading you into paradise in the present moment. In this moment, here and now, God is with us. In this moment, wherever you are in this Christmas Eve, geographically, in France or Britain, Scandinavia or America, or, of course, in Ireland, wherever you are, God is with us. And wherever you are emotionally, whatever shadow chokes you, engulfs you, whatever darkness wraps itself around you and makes you feel incapable of functioning, even here in this darkness, God is present. The Christ is born in the night, in the stable, King of the universe, Emmanuel. And this is Christmas Eve. Thank you for being here. Bye-bye.